How do you capture ambivalence about the internet and millennial life in a book of essays? John Taliaferro will be here to discuss her first book, already a New York Times bestseller, Trick Mirror. Who was America's first conservationist? John Taliaferro will be here to talk about his book, Grinnell. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. John Taliaferro joins us now. She is the author of a new essay collection, her first book. It's called Trick Mirror, Reflections on Self-Delusion. Gia, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
So you got an MFA in fiction writing from the University of Michigan, and an early story of yours was a finalist for the Pushcart Prize. So I think we were all waiting for the novel. Where is the novel? I know you've written one.
The novel is deep in a drawer where it shall remain evermore.
Really? No return to fiction for you?
I would love to try to write fiction again. It's been hard for me to do on the side. It's been hard for me to do since I moved to New York. For a while, I was working in such the high volume blogosphere. And, lately, my sense of interiority is so closely tied to my own because I've been writing so much from like a personal interiority in my work at The New Yorker and for this book that something about it, I haven't been able to write fiction at all. But, in general, I applied to that program mostly because, it was still kind of post-recession. I was trying to figure out a way
Which
that
recession?
I could... 2008.
Okay. We all had our recessions.
Yeah,
Which was yours?
That one was mine. And I was just trying to figure out a way to be paid to write. And I had not been able to find a way to get paid full-time to write. And the Michigan program was really generous. And I think I thought that if I did it, I would figure out what I was good at, or if I could write, and it sort of slid me very luckily into journalism. But I loved writing fiction. I mean, I often feel like I'll never be reading more closely or be read more closely than I was in that program. Like, it taught me so much about, I loved every second of working on that shelved novel.
What do you like about fiction what can you do there that you can't do in your essay writing?
I've been thinking, there's so much about the world that you can't express through the realm of argument. There's so much nuance about interpersonal interaction and ironies. And there are a lot of subtler, more interior truths about the world that you just can't really get at through trying to make a point in any way, which as much as I've been kind of trying to get around that in my writing, you can't get around trying to make a point of some sort in nonfiction or reporting. And yeah, and to me, fiction feels like I still maybe like it a little bit better as a reader. It feels like art and magic, and it feels like the best kind of fiction. You can't imagine how anyone could possibly have written it. It just appears out of nowhere, as if from the divine, kind of.
Yes.
And with nonfiction, I feel, that one of the pleasures is in feeling how someone shaped it. I think I understand the mechanisms of it so much more. And maybe that's just me, yeah.
When I think about journalism versus fiction writing, to me, they feel like very, very different sort of trades, almost, journalism feels like more of a trade and fiction, as you said, an art. And so when one of our colleagues here, we talked recently about, and she was on the podcast,
oh, yeah, I listened
Taffy,
to that one.
wrote us our actor.
But of course, I knew she would write a great novel. Of course.
Right.
Because her profiles are so novelistic.
But a lot of it also is voice. And you have a very strong voice.
Thank you.
Which, in a way, I imagine can work in your favor, but also possibly against you, right? Because you have to kind of get out of your own voice and adopt a new voice.
Right. And that's what I think that's my problem right now. I've been kind of developing the muscle of this very personal voice. And right now I can't kind of, be a ventriloquist for something completely imagined right now. But I've been saying if I get fired tomorrow, I'll move to the woods.
Or if you get sick of your voice.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm always sick of my voice. But that's the fun of writing, is to try to hop around that. I'm sick of, everything. I think we are often sick of the world that we live in, and yet we have to find a way to leapfrog that and make it surprising and bearable and fresh. And that's part of what I find fun about writing in general. But yeah.
Well, in the last line of your book jacket, it calls this book an instant classic of the worst decade yet.
Yeah, the book jacket copy is just that was definitely me suggesting things kind of as a joke and then it just sticking. So one of the essays in the book is about what I term the 7 defining scams of the millennial generation or the millennial era. And so I finished college just after the recession in 2008, and I feel that, from the recession to the election in 2016, We are beginning to see just so many of our institutions crumble, so many of the pathways of sort of like logic and facticity just splinter and fall away. And like the rise of the internet in the very particular way that it exists in contemporary culture, the turn between the internet feeling good and it being very obviously quite bad in many ways, all of these things just kind of hardened or feel like they've been hardening over the past decade.
So people have now done their math and figured out that you're a millennial if they haven't already been, heard you being called sort of the millennial voice, the voice of the millennial generation.
How embarrassing for my generation.
No. I was going to say, I thought you were going to say how embarrassing for you. How do you feel about being called the millennial voice?
I think I react childishly to it. Like I'm just like very earmuffsy about it. I think it's a wild term. I mean, it's obviously very flattering. I think it's mostly indicative of what I write about, less anything about me.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely just kind of look away from that. I think that it seems like there shouldn't be a voice of a generation. There are so many. It's kind of self-evident that the only bad things can come from designating someone like a singular in any way. So yeah, I just kind of am flattered, but not taking that seriously at all.
When you mentioned graduating in 2008, you described it as a period of recession, which obviously was the material concern for anyone looking for a paying job. But it was also, of course, the year that Obama was elected, and you had 2 administrations of Obama to kind of begin your writing career under.
Yeah.
And then you went to The New Yorker, right, following Donald Trump's election. So you were going from the internet, very different kind of political atmosphere, to Donald Trump, and then working for this storied historical weekly magazine. And I'm curious, how did your writing change, and how much of that was influenced by the political situation changing, and how much by the kind of the form that you were writing in change?
I never expected, graduating when I did, that I would end up even ever with a full-time media job at all. And I think when I got the opportunity to go to The New Yorker, it was like, I think there are so few writers my age that get the chance to be really supported by institutional scaffolding, that get to be fact-checked and get to spend a lot of time on things. And that's a luxury that it was clear to me was extremely rare and getting rarer, by the month. And so I think in terms of the practice of work, that's what felt different. Suddenly having the sort of a place that was structured to be able to support its writers the way that The New Yorker does felt like a miracle, and it still often does. Like to get to spend 5 months thinking about something, it's such a luxury. I had become a little bit suspicious of my own involvement in the constant churn of internet sort of call and response. Everything I had written had been published immediately. I'd get feedback immediately. Most of it was incredibly nice. And I was just worried about that. I was worried about what that was doing to me to always have a reaction right away. And I wanted that pleasure that I'd gotten writing the novel, working in private, just for myself for a long time. And I had gotten that feeling a little bit as soon as I started at The New Yorker, and I found it just like the deepest pleasure.
How does it change the writing itself, do you think? Not having that, what is everyone going to think? What is everyone's reaction going to be? Right next to you at every second?
Well, for better or worse, I was never really thinking about that too much. I would think about that more as an editor because I worked as an editor, and I would try to guard to the extent that I was able. I would try to edit to protect my writers or whatever. For myself, I don't really have that tick. I'm so internally worried about being fair all the time, about just not wanting to waste anyone's time, that I think mostly my internal bar was the one that I was always trying to pass. But I think how it changed the writing was just, in a lot of ways, the story of, media in the last, however many years is a story of people's attention spans getting contracted and splintered. And, that's true for writers as well. And I think it's just being able to take my time. I'm sure that it changed my writing in some way. It's hard to say how, but it feels different.
One of the things that strikes me about your writing is that, as an essayist, is that it seems like you're less concerned with making an argument and sort of forwarding your argument and bringing everyone along as you are with arguing with yourself in a way and sort of constantly flipping something around and re-examining what you think of it and showing that process through your writing. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, and I think that's what, I was saying earlier about me not necessarily really thinking about what other people are going to think, what they're going to react, because I'm arguing with myself first and foremost, and the hurdles that I have to jump in terms of not wasting anyone's time and not trying to pull the wool over, that's all in my own head. This might be the generational thing where, I've sort of come of age as a writer in a time where, understanding something doesn't necessarily lead to anything, to you being able to do anything about that thing, and where the internet gives us this feeling of being able to know everything about anything, but often feeling like we're able to do less and less every day. Just the question of what is the use of understanding something is kind of this like meta question hovering in my mind. And I also think that I've been writing in a time where the media ecosystem has changed in such a way where the idea that anyone's mind could be changed, the idea that I could or should convince anyone of anything or, tell them any way about how to live, especially, it sort of seems kind of off the table,
right,
as a desirable or even possible thing.
When you think about a lot of essayists, some recent, some contemporary, if you think about Christopher Hitchens, you get the sense of like, I am the authority, let me tell you how it is, I'm going to show you the way. You never get that, or I don't get that from your writing. I don't feel like you go into it thinking, I have a take and I need to show people what that is, or I have a point to make. So I'm curious, without those things, what inspires you to write about a given subject?
It's always a question. It's never I have a take. So this is one of the things I dislike the most about writing, and it is the thing that with the Christopher Hitchens type, this model of authority and this model of, I know what I think, I'm going to write this essay to prove it. I don't like that. The thing that I'm always looking for in writing is to shift my own thinking somewhere new. It's like, what's the point of being alive and what's the point of writing, especially if we are not starting and ending a piece in a different place? I always think
you're not starting knowing the answer, you're starting knowing the question.
Always starting knowing the question, and I'm not sure how often I even end knowing the answer, but I know I'm done when I've gotten somewhere new at all. And I always think about Deborah Eisenberg, who I had as an undergrad at the University of Virginia. I think it was in a Paris Review, Art of Fiction, she talks about writing being making a set of Gibbon's yield. And I think about that, like that's what I'm looking for. I think that that's what I'm looking for in life right now, right? I don't want an authority to tell me definitively what the correct way to think is and what the way forward is, because I'm not sure that nothing in my brain has felt like that's an appropriate response, especially over the last 2 years. Like everything is more complicated than that.
And that feels very much like a millennial approach and also like an internet influenced approach, and that you're constantly aware that there's another lens through which to view something.
Yeah, but I also think it's a straining against the conventions of the internet, right? Where the more compressed writing is, the more personality based it is, the more it has to be reacted to in a very small space and kind of interacted with these mechanisms of dislike, of disapproval or approval, the more it leads people to want to know, like, what's the takeaway? Is it good? Is it bad? Do I like this thing? Do I not? Do I like the person that wrote it? Do I not? And those are kind of the ways the internet asks us to evaluate things. And I think a lot of my work has been straining against that explicitly.
So you're obviously very internet influenced and like a lot of things about the internet, but also, and maybe even more obviously, dislike a lot about the internet or are troubled by things about the internet. What bothers you most right now?
Right now? Well, a lot of things. Well, how long do we have? What bothers me most right now, two things come immediately to mind. One is the way that I've been thinking about it so much with, just the moral outrages of the last few years, of the last week even. The internet, it sort of corrals our good intentions in the realm of expression and kind of keeps them there. Like you think about all of our just deep, real anguish about gun control, about those kids in Mississippi. And the internet I wrote in the book, it can keep people really busy figuring out the exact correct way of explaining these things rather than, and then it just keeps us separate from the actual mechanisms of power through which, border separation and ICE raids take place. There's also, I think, something running through the book is, I think who we are as people the internet is structured around all of these platforms that their economic model is monetizing and reselling the data that revolves around personal identity. Like selfhood is like the economic engine of the contemporary internet. And I find that so interesting, but also so scary, because I think who we are, and I mean Facebook, Twitter, right? They are analyzing our data. They're selling ads against our preferences. Like it's selfhood is really the petroleum of the internet. And I think who we are and what we do to figure that out, and the questions we ask Google, our relationships that we have with our friends that are now kind of often rerouted through social networks or captured by social networks in some way. Like these things are so precious. Our quest towards self-determination and self-actualization and understanding the world and ourselves, it's important. And I feel that it's doing something very strange, very slowly, but noticeably over time. It's doing something very strange to have our selfhood bear the weight of this commercial importance. I think that is kind of like a slow-burning crisis that will not go away as long as the internet's economic model is what it is.
Do you feel like as a writer that the internet sort of fuels you, kind of energizes you, gives you fodder on which to write, or does it sap the energy, sort of take away the creative impulse?
Yeah, so this is another way, like I am a creature of the internet. I don't think I would have a career if it wasn't for the internet. I started editing this blog, The Hairpin, long may it live, even though it's dead, while I was in grad school. I couldn't have afforded to move to New York and, try to take an internship. Like I needed the internet's sort of democratizing force, and it's the avenues that it's opened up for writers without, quote unquote traditional backgrounds or, connections or anything. And, young people, women, people of color, right? Like I've benefited from it in so many ways. So in a lot of ways, it has directly fed me. It has directly allowed me to have this career. And one of the things that I realized in that grad school program was, we were given just blocks of luxurious time to write fiction. And I found that my brain was like, wait, I need a full-time job right now. I think there is something about me that is not necessarily good, but has always been present, that takes to quickness and wants, has a high metabolism for information and likes the speed and the sort of, I liked it when I was working at Jezebel. I liked the speed of trying to write something that was decently good on a really, really, really kind of horrendous timeline. At the same time, I can feel, after a day of looking at the internet, I feel like someone's just taken a sledgehammer to my cerebral cortex. I can feel my attention span like a little grasshopper that's moving all around the table and won't sit still. I can feel it sort of on an everyday basis, how it is kind of degrading my sense of scale and reason.
Do you shut it out when you're doing this kind of writing, when you're writing essays, when you're trying to work on a book?
Yeah, I have blockers. The blocker on my phone is called Freedom. The one on my Google Chrome on my computer is called Self-Control. Extremely sort of George Saunders-y, Orwellian names for these things. I have sort of time safeguards for how much I use the internet. And after I stopped working as an editor, one of the great pleasures was not having to look at the internet to keep up with every bit of the news. Now I can, if I'm trying to focus on something, I can not look at the computer, not look at Twitter for a while. I shut it out.
What do you consider to be your subjects? Like, is there something where you're like, that's something where either A, I feel like I want to write about it beyond that question, or B, this is something where I feel like my readers will want to have me write about this. There's something I could say here.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of it is becoming the internet.
Your friend.
Unfortunately, I've been realizing more and more. But also, almost everything these days is routed through the internet. Like at The New Yorker, I tend to write about young people stuff. I tend to do the pieces where I'm going to have to talk to a lot of college students and high schoolers, which I love because I don't think that young people are written about very well in the media at all, ever. And they're so smart and they understand that our world is in structural crisis extremely well. Like they understand it at a cellular level. And so I really like talking to them. I think my subjects are sort of, at The New Yorker, it's tending to be like youth phenomena and feminism and the way those things intersect. I think that maybe a deeper current underneath what I write about is like algorithmically dictated selfhood. I think I'm interested in writing about how systems shape the self in any way. Like cultural systems, religious systems, political systems, algorithmic systems shape the self. One thing that lights up whenever I know like I'm dying to write about this is when I am really repelled by something and attracted to it simultaneously, which I am beginning to think that's maybe how I feel about everything. About, the fact of being alive.
Which essayists do you admire?
Oh, man. I love Ellen Willis, Greg Tate. I love as critics. I remember reading Zadie Smith's first collection and thinking, here is someone who writes with so much force and clarity, but also seems very aware of the possibility that she's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that felt wild to me. It felt like realizing that it could rain at the same time that it was sunny. The first time you see a sun shower, like that's what it felt like. I love Patricia Lockwood as an essayist. I love Eula Biss. I love Leslie Jameson. I love George Saunders as an essayist.
I was going to say, they're all young women, but you've got a man in there.
Got a man in there. Yeah, and of course, like Sontag, Didion, like that.
All right, I'm going to end with, since you brought up Joan Didion, something that's probably been haunting you since your book promotion sort of started getting out there in the world, which is that your boss, your editor, David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, compared you with Joan Didion. What did you think when you read that?
I looked away as if the sun was shining too bright, Here's what I think about that comparison. It's definitely it's incredibly embarrassing for my generation because it's like, how far have we fallen if I'm the one that's getting that, But I think that Didion and I have obviously, we have incredibly different energies as writers. I am extremely kind of silly, and she had that incredible, white-hot neurasthenic, this brilliant, intellectual strength and fragility at the same time, right? And my writing's
cool, very cool.
She's also so cool. I'm a huge mess all over the place all the time. My writing is not cool and dispassionate at all. I do think the connection there is maybe dread of the time and the forces that are underneath the time, and yet sort of an indelible fascination with that dread and what's causing it. The only connection maybe is that sort of zeitgeisty dread.
Let's end on that cheerful note.
Yeah.
Gia, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Gia Tolentino is the author of a new book of essays. It's called Trick Mirror: Reflections on Self-Delusion. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. John Taliaferro joins us now from Montana. His new book is called Grinnell, America's Environmental Pioneer and His Restless Drive to Save the West. John, thanks for being here.
Delighted.
I'm going to start with a confession, which is that several of us at the book review assumed that this book was about the same man for whom Grinnell, Iowa, and Grinnell College, the alma mater of my predecessor here at the book review, was named. But that is not true. That was Josiah Bushnell Grinnell. So who is your subject, George Bird Grinnell?
Well, a great newspaper, the New York Times, upon Grinnell's death in 1938, declared him the father of American conservation. Of course, he was that and so much more. Born 1849, died in 1938. And in that long life, he did things like found the first Audubon Society. He and Teddy Roosevelt created the Boone and Crockett Club, the gentlemen's hunting group that Grinnell turned into one of the great conservation organizations of the day, probably the eminent, certainly the most trusted and informed, indeed progressive Native American ethnologist of his day. A real adventurer, helped establish what national parks would be, almost single-handedly created Glacier National Park. Every little step of the way in the American conservation movement seemed to have George Bird Grinnell's footprints on it. It's a vast story, and And in fact, it's so big, no one's really taken a run at it till now.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is this the first major biography?
Well, people carry little pieces of it. For instance, Grinnell was fascinated by Native American history. He spent days, hours, weeks, months, years amongst the Blackfeet Indians of Montana and the Cheyenne Indians of Montana and Oklahoma, getting their histories. He got there soon enough to get some of the accounts of the great Indian fights with the American Army and their accounts of when whites first came into their territory. So people care about that stuff. Historians know him for that. Conservation historians, of course, are devoted to him. He was really the prototype of the American environmentalist.
So you've mentioned places like Glacier National Park, Oklahoma. We'll talk about Yellowstone, Great Plains Indians. But this was a guy, he was born in Brooklyn. His father was a New Yorker. How did he become interested in America's frontier?
Well, he's like me and many others. He had this romantic notion of the American West. Grinnell was born in Brooklyn in 1849, and when he was about 6, his father moved the family up to the Upper West Side of New York, what was called Audubon Park, about 155th Street. It was rural, and they thought it would be healthier up there. His father bought the estate of none other than John James Audubon. Audubon, the great bird illustrator. Audubon had died a couple of years before Grinnell came on, but his wife and sons were there, and Grinnell really absorbed the spirit of Audubon. And when Grinnell graduated from Yale in 1870, he really didn't want to go to work for his father on Wall Street, so he went west with one of the professors from Yale, the great paleontologist Othniel March. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed a year before in 1869, so for the very first time, people could, if you will, commute to the West. And Marsh and Grinnell and his other Yale buddies, all greenhorns, went out west and got off the train in the middle of Nebraska and started picking up dinosaur bones by the crate load. It was one of the great paleontological digs of all time. I wanted to call this book initially The Evolution and Extinction of George Burns Grinnell because, well, his evolution from sort of romantic greenhorn to enlightened Western conservationists were an evolution, and also the extinction because people have forgotten about him today. But there was another extinction going on. He saw the dinosaurs, and then he realized, look, the buffalo are going, and with them the Native Americans. So he turned around when he got back to New York and devoted the rest of his life to trying to do something about that.
So he goes from this dinosaur dig next out to the Black Hills with George Custer, or was there something in between?
Well, he was a trained naturalist. He was a great birder. He'd studied under one of the great scientists of the day, Marsh. So he was invited as a naturalist to go on this reconnaissance of the Black Hills with Custer. Up close and personal, the closer he got to Custer, we saw him for the blowhard he was, and he also really earned some cred as a naturalist and kept getting invited back the following year. He went to Yellowstone for the first time, which had been not a national park, but the national park, the only one in the country.
How did he end up helping to map Yellowstone?
They got off a ferry up on the Missouri River and rode down. Took them weeks to get there. He helped work on the surveying it, but the real thing was, what was a national park in the 1870s? Nobody really knew. Mm-hmm. And Grinnell, because he'd been concerned about the imminent extinction or diminishment of the buffalo anyway, saw that a national park could be a game preserve. And no one was really articulating what that was, and he was one of the first guys to do it. That national parks would be a place not just where you go and admire the wonders of geysers or the Grand Canyons or the sequoias down in Yosemite, but it was a place to preserve our natural heritage. Mm-hmm. And that real germ of an idea is carried forward to today.
So as you mentioned, this was the beginning of our conceiving of what a national park would be, but also the idea of conservation was still under development. The other person that we sort of associate with that phrase, father of conservation, is Teddy Roosevelt. How did and he, of course, knew Teddy Roosevelt. But let's start first with that idea of conservation. How did Grinnell conceive of conservation, and did his notion differ from that of Teddy Roosevelt?
They weren't too far apart. So you have other conservationists we all know. We have Thoreau, we have John Muir, we have George Perkins March, who wrote the great book Man and Nature in the 1860s. But Grinnell was a New Yorker as well as a Westerner. What was going on in New York? It was what was called the progressive movement. What was progressivism? It was a reform movement, people concerned with the overcrowding of cities, the corruption, the monopolies, all of the anxieties about the urbanization of America. What Grinnell did was take the notion of conservation and bring it into a progressive movement. There's the link, of course, to Roosevelt, who started out as a reformer in New York, police commissioner, governor. And so they were fellow travelers and like-minded and also hunters. So when they got together at this dinner in the December of 1887, about 10 of these good, well-heeled New Yorkers who were all big game sportsmen said, we need to start a club. Grinnell and Roosevelt really saw it as an opportunity to bring conservation into the conversation. That's hard to say.
How did he get to know Teddy Roosevelt?
Roosevelt, as listeners will recall, his wife and mother had died on the same day. He went out to Dakota, bought a ranch, and came back and wrote a book called Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. Grinnell reviewed it in the magazine Forest and Stream, which he owned and edited and became really the platform for a lot of his efforts on behalf of conservation. He reviewed it, and Roosevelt was 10 years younger, and he chided Roosevelt for mistakes in the book. You can imagine Teddy Roosevelt being told that he had made mistakes, and he stormed into Grinnell's office. You can just see his teeth bared. Mm-hmm. And they talked, and Roosevelt simmered down, and they realized that they had a lot in common, and it was a friendship forged then and continued till Roosevelt's death. When Roosevelt became president in September 1901 with the assassination of McKinley, suddenly the president of the Boone and Crockett Club, Grinnell and Roosevelt's conservation organization, became the president of the United States. Think of the leverage there.
One of the things I think that confounds people today who are interested in the environment about the early conservation movement is this tie between conservation and hunting. And you have someone like Grinnell who was concerned about the buffalo dying off, and yet he himself was a big game hunter. Can you explain that contradiction, and how did people like Grinnell reconcile those two things?
A friend of mine asked me just yesterday, well, is Grinnell sort of descendant of somebody like Thoreau? And I immediately said, no, it's a hunting tradition. These gentlemen sportsmen who were hunting around in New York and the East, they had private hunting clubs. They realized that the things they wanted to kill were dying off. There was commercial hunting. These birds were being served in restaurants. Their feathers were being used in women's hats. It was harder to find this game, and out of enlightened self-interest, they said, we've got to pass laws so this can continue. Yeah, that's a sort of a disconnect there, and they had a real blind spot for predators. The same problem today. Any animal higher than they in the food chain, bears, wolves, mountain lions, they just thought was fair game to kill because these were the animals that killed the things they wanted to kill. Now, you go forward today, groups like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, even the Boone and Crockett Club, these people believe what Grinnell and Roosevelt believed, that hunters can be good stewards. Mm-hmm. That's a tough sell to some audiences today, but I think they're sincere.
Well, you live in Texas and Montana. Both of those areas have many people who still hold those beliefs today. So presumably you're accustomed to hearing that contradiction. But at the time, it wasn't controversial that someone would hold those views simultaneously.
No, it wasn't controversial. Now, on the other hand, there was an elitism associated with it. Most people, once they got settled in and had jobs, I'm not talking about Daniel Boone and the frontier, hunting was a luxury, and as it is today, is an expensive sport. So there was this notion that this was a rich man's game. Grinnell tried somewhat effectively to dispel that mythology, but yet a lot of these organizations were, the members were well-to-do. And when you think today of other conservation organizations, and I'm not talking about hunting groups, I'm talking about groups like the Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund, World Wildlife Conservation Society. As a generalization, their memberships are well-to-do, educated, coastal elites.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who care about what's going on in the heartland, whether they live there or not.
Grinnell was not only interested in big game, but he, as you mentioned early on, he had so many interests related to the land and conservation, but also the people, and in particular, the Great Plains Indians. How did he become interested in Native Americans and write about them, and what did he do on their behalf?
Grinnell's curiosity about Native Americans began as a young boy reading James Fenimore Cooper and Francis Parkman, people like that. His first real encounter was when he went west the year after he graduated, and there were Pawnee scouts helping guide their dinosaur dig. He went back 2 years later and went on one of the last great buffalo hunts on the Great Plains with the Pawnee Indians. Onward from there, in the mid-'80s, he went up for the very first time to the Blackfeet Reservation, mostly to hunt and to climb mountains. But he started getting to know Indians, and some of the stereotypes and the romantic generalizations fell away, and he started to realize what their struggle was, what their plight, and what their dignity and integrity were. And so there were two pieces of it. One, he wanted to get their history down before it was wiped out, which he did very avidly and with great dedication, and also advocate for them. Now, you can say he was paternalistic because he sometimes referred to them as his children, but he was incredibly progressive for his day. He believed they should live communally on the reservations. He worked to get bad agents removed. He tried to keep miners and cattlemen out. He would go to Washington and advocate for Indians. He knew them personally, and he really was one of the more enlightened whites towards Native Americans of his era. That was one of the pleasant things to discover when I worked on this book. I didn't have to apologize for him.
Well, obviously, he was a man of his time and was very progressive for that era. What made you want to write about him now?
He's been stalking me for years. I've written a number of books that all take place in the late 19th, early 20th century, really thinking about that transition from this notion of this frontier nation to modernization. And Grinnell just kept popping up. I thought I was going to write a book about this young New Yorker who went out trying to get one last squeeze out of the toothpaste tube of the Wild West. And then I realized that as I got into this 40,000 pages of his letters, that he was a busier man than that. And he's a little bit, all biography is autobiography. You bring your own curiosities to it. And he was a man who went back and forth. I realized that the first time, and starting in 1869, a person could go out west for a vacation and come back, and that changed our whole understanding of the West and our whole treatment of it. And in essence, I grew up in the East. I went to school in the East. I'm an entitled white guy to a certain extent, and so I thought, well, I get this guy.
If George Bird Grinnell were to return to the areas of the West today that he spent time in back then, to go back to the Black Hills and to Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, what do you think he would make of sort of what we have done with the legacy that he left?
A little bittersweet, but I think he would have been proud of what he has accomplished. I think he was trying to keep the money changers out of the temple. He was trying to keep railroads and miners out of the parks. He was trying to keep the public lands available to the public. I think he would think, well, the fights that I fought 100 and plus years ago are the fights that are going on today. We think of what's going on in Bears Ears in Utah. I don't think he would think, well, he framed the conversation. So I think he would have some satisfaction there. On the other hand, I don't think he would anticipate 3 million tourists in Yellowstone Park would be the greatest thing.
All right. Thank you so much, John. John Taliaferro is the author of a new biography, Grinnell, America's Environmental Pioneer and His Restless Drive to Save the West. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Lauren Christensen, Andrew Lavallee, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, Lauren. What are you reading?
I just finished Tar Baby. I spent the weekend, as you know, I imagine maybe some of our listeners also did, binge reading Toni Morrison. Tar Baby was one that I confess I'd really barely heard anything about. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's just not as commonly referenced among her really canonical titles. But it's a beautiful story about displaced Americans who are living on a Caribbean island where a wealthy white couple lives with their black servants and this beautiful European-educated black model whom they're supporting financially, and the white patron has put her through her education and everything. I picked it up expecting the usual knockout prose, and there certainly is that. One of my favorite lines is actually one of the servants on the island, and it's just this mind-blowing, evocative description of the relationship between language and emotion and meaning. It's this servant, her name is Therese, and she's getting carried away with a conspiracy theory, if I can just read a little bit of it. The more she invented, the more she rocked, and the more she rocked, the more her English crumbled, till finally it became dust in her mouth, stopping the flow of her imagination, and she spat it out altogether and let the story shimmer through the clear cascade of the French of Dominique. So there are sentences like that I would just read over and over again. And in addition to that, it's Morrison's usual blistering social critique, really, of race relations and class relations and the painful underbelly of maternal love. But, it's a disturbing and also very comic portrayal of rich white America. But what I didn't expect when I was reading this was such a hauntingly sort of hot love story. And, I'm going to try not to get censored on here.
Hauntingly hot.
Yeah, it was really just it's like you're in heat reading this book. And there isn't even any actual sex. It's really incredible. And, I think by the end you're just sort of like, okay, well, this is no surprise. Toni could write a build-up or, just the insinuation of sex like you've never seen. And it's just, the whole time you're thinking like, God, she was just the coolest, But yeah.
I miss her already.
Have you read this, Andrew?
I did, yeah, a couple of years ago. So for what I'm reading, I decided this summer that I was going to read 200 short stories for a couple of reasons. There were a bunch of story collections that I was about 12% into and wanted to just finish them. There's also a never-ending list of writers that I wanted to get to know better and thought this might be a way of doing that. And I just love a summer project and making lists. But the one that's kind of stuck in my head is a story collection by Nafisa Thompson Spires called Heads of the Colored People. It is all about black people, but it is black people who don't have black friends, black people who are into cosplay, black men who are grad students in anthropology at UC Riverside, other characters who are sort of defying some of the commonly held assumptions about their racial identity. There are all sorts of clever references to contemporary African-American writers and intellectuals in the stories, like Donica Kelly, Ishmael Reed, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And it also kind of cycles through all different kinds of emotions, including stories that are really funny. There's one story that is a series of increasingly spectacular notes between two mothers whose daughters aren't getting along. The notes kind of start off passive-aggressively and get into veiled threats and then just naked aggression. It's a pretty breathtaking exchange to read.
I have a question. Why 200? How did you pick your number?
I thought that I could bite off 200, although I started off really strong and I'm starting to struggle now, also because there's other just novels that I want to get to. Right now, I am at number 126. But I've told myself that I'm operating by the technical end of summer.
That was my next question. Is it Labor Day or are we going to September 20th?
So in the Northern Hemisphere, I have until September 23rd.
Okay.
Wow. Are you picking and choosing stories from collections or are you reading whole collections?
I'm doing a little bit of both. I've read a couple of just books and finished off whole collections, and now I'm starting to get into more like stories in the New Yorker that people have told me about that I should get to, or picking and choosing standout stories in collections, but not necessarily worrying about finishing the whole book. And I'm also open to suggestions.
Is flash fiction considered cheating?
That's a good question.
Ask him on September 21st.
No, I will say that Andrew very kindly, and I was flattered, shared his spreadsheet of the stories with me. And at first I was going to give him grief for the fact that there were a few Diane Williams stories on there because those are like less than a page. But then when I did the math, 200 stories is actually, you almost have to do some of that or else you're never going to get it done.
Yeah, that's the reason for Diane Williams.
Not to be discouraging.
Just for the tally. I'm reading this week, or I should say I'm sort of turning back to, because I started reading this about a month ago, but then work distracted me for a good while. A book that I had been meaning to read for a very long time was published in the late 60s or early 70s, and I'm not only reading it to say this title on the podcast, but it is called A Wop Babaloo Bop A Lop Bam Boom. The Golden Age of Rock by Nick Cohn, C-O-H-N, a British journalist who's still with us, and he wrote this book when he was all of 22. He moved to the west coast of Ireland for, I think, 2 months or so to write it in one big burst. And it's somewhat incredible for many reasons. First of all, it's obviously the late 60s, so the golden age of rock is a weirdly prescient but unusual thing to say at that point. The Beatles are just breaking up, and in many ways, rock is still going very strong. But Cohn really loved pop music, and he loved Elvis and he loved Little Richard, and he saw coming on the horizon things that he didn't like. He found Led Zeppelin, I think, embarrassing was the word he used. He thought Pink Floyd was very boring. Basically, the grandiose, sort of pretentious 1970s version of rock left him cold. And being 22, he's full of vigor. His writing is very fast-paced, very voicey, as they say, but it's also incredibly intelligent and descriptive. It doesn't read just like a young man's rant. And it functions as kind of a catalog of early rock so that the chapters are titled things like Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, classic rock, high school rock, and then later Phil Spector and the Beatles. And he kind of takes you through in these mini chapters just an almost encyclopedia of the subject. He says early on, just to show you his sort of sociological sharpness, in the first chapter, he writes about how teenagers obviously were a huge reason why rock became so big, because teenagers had this disposable income for the first time. And he said, after all this time, teenagers had finally made it through to the promised land and they'd found it barren. Definitely, it was frustrating. They had all this money, nothing to do with it, and they went spare. Always, the moment of maximum revolt comes just when things are beginning to get better, when the first liberalization sets in. When kids had nothing at all, they had somehow accepted it. Now that life was easier, they began to riot. I love that line. And Cohn himself, now that I'm looking into his life, had a really interesting story. He's still with us, like I said, but he wrote a cover story for New York Magazine in 1975 that became the movie Saturday Night Fever. And then I guess in the late 90s, he admitted that his story was completely made up, that he had gotten to Brooklyn, been like thrown up on by someone coming out of a club, went back to Manhattan, and just based his character of Vincent on this one guy he saw in a doorway, and then he filled it in with what he knew about the mods in London.
Really?
Yeah, and so he said that he's happy that Saturday Night Fever became this enduring thing, and it's a great story, but that he felt some accountability.
Yeah, I want a whole list of confessions from journalists who made up stories.
It's a great idea, actually.
All right,
for an
you
anthology.
compile it.
Compile and edit. What
That's
about you,
right.
Pamela? What are you reading this week?
I cheated on a longer book that I'm reading with a graphic novel, which is the way to cheat, because I was able to finish the book in a few hours, and it's really fantastic. The book is called Kid Gloves, 9 Months of Careful Chaos by Lucy Knisley. Now, I could be mispronouncing it. It could be Knisley. It's spelled Knisley. And she is perhaps the first author that I discovered via Instagram. I fell in love with her comics on Instagram. And, it's that feeling you feel like you've discovered someone. Of course, she has 187,000 followers on Instagram, and she's written now 4 books at least. So it's not like I'm onto anything new, but I do feel like that sense of discovery of finding a true genius among us. Her Instagram comics have largely been about, lately, her cat, Linny. I just urge you to go online, go onto Instagram. Even if you're not an Instagram person, look up Lucy Knisley, read about Linny. You will fall in love with Linny. And then as you get towards the end of her feed, you will also become deeply upset because Linny is not well. And I'm just like hanging on. I check Instagram constantly to see if she's posted. Linny is on medication. And Linny has this great voice. She's just this very supercilious, superior creature. She speaks in her own way with a very haughty kind of language. So I love Linny. And then I discovered that Lucy has written books in addition. I came across, she had a picture book this year called New Baby, which is just a joy. But this graphic novel is something different. It is about Knisley's efforts to get pregnant and have a baby. And without going into too great detail, she does have a couple of miscarriages before she has a baby. And then when she gets pregnant, it is not an easy pregnancy and it is not an easy labor. So this is not a baby shower gift. This is not something you want to give to someone who is contemplating getting pregnant. This is for people like me who have been through that war and are well past it. And because it's been 10 years since I've given birth to a baby or been pregnant or even contemplated any such thing, I really had no interest in this kind of book. I thought I was really done with anything having to do with pregnancy and motherhood. And it's a little bit like reading Rachel Cusk's A Life's Work, where you just feel this resentful feeling of I was done with that subject. Why are you making me interested in it again? But she does it so well. A couple things she does in here really beautifully. One is that it's a real feminist history of gynecology and obstetrics and looking back at the ways in which those two areas of medicine have, ironically, but perhaps not surprisingly, been largely handled by men and the way in which that has led to all kinds of misguided practices. And she's just brilliant. She obviously did a lot of research and capturing just how misogynistic gynecology has been as an area of medicine. And the other thing she does really amazingly well, and this is something only graphic novelists can do, is to capture states of emotion and being through her artwork. So there's a period where after Lucy has her first miscarriage, the text on this page says, I'm going to read it out loud and then just describe a little bit what the pictures are like. It took weeks and I was in agony. What happened was she waited for her miscarriage to happen naturally. I bled for 40 days. I was in a fog for months. I had to take off from work and felt disconnected from everything, from my friends, my husband, my new city. I couldn't be reached. I felt as if I had been blown to bits. So I think the text is actually pretty powerful. And then you see the drawings, and she's so inventive. There's one image where she says, I couldn't be reached, and she is just a face in a sea of kind of dark scribbles, wearing glasses in which the scribbles are reflected. She's also written two other memoirs. One is called Relish My Life in the Kitchen, and one is called Something New, Tales from a Makeshift Bride. I have zero interest in these subjects, and yet I will read both of these books.
Oh, that's great. Can I ask how you found her Instagram feed?
Was
it through Roz Chast? Because I know you love her Instagram. It may have been
through Roz Chast. My guiding philosophy on Instagram is, really very simple. One, avoid anyone who takes a vacation because it just upsets me. Even if I'm on vacation and I'm somewhere great.
This is a rough time of year for that.
It's a terrible time of year. I'm trying to stay off because even if I'm, somewhere really great, I see then people on a beach or in a mountain setting and I think, or by a lake or just doing something simple like being in Maine. And I think why aren't I the person who's doing that? And it just makes me feel bad about my vacation.
I'm going to be in Maine in a week and a half.
Yeah, please don't post.
I'll Instagram it.
Thanks. So the thing I do like on Instagram is illustration and comic book artists. And so I probably found her through a suggested list.
Yeah, she didn't end up in your algorithm, John?
No, she didn't. But I'm going to ask Pamela for more suggestions too because I need to vary up my dogs and friends on vacation list.
Yeah, part of this is my ongoing campaign in this department to convert, yes, all these three people in the studio with me are dog people, even though I feel it is an established truth that cats are the more literary animal. They are. So Lauren's heard this before. So I will corner you, John, after this with Lucy Knisley's Instagram feed.
I'll get to know Linny and see what it does.
All right. Okay. Let's go down the books again. Lauren?
Tar Baby by Toni Morrison.
Heads of the Colored People by Nafisa Thompson Spires.
I read A Wop Baba Loo Bop, A Lop Bam Boom by Nick Cohn.
With such feeling.
Yes.
And I read Lucy Knisley's Kid Gloves, 9 Months of Careful Chaos. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Head Stepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.